The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Okay, so we can agree that there's lots of problems. Were these problems solved during the populist era? No, were not solved. No. Lots of labor problems. So essentially what we're going to do now is we're going to move to the progressive era, which isn't that much different. But the support now will come from the urban middle class. And that's going to make all the difference. It doesn't mean that the rural people are just going to be like, well, we don't care about these things anymore. But because the center of wealth and power is shifting from the rural areas to the urban areas and political power, once you have the backing of the middle class who had not been that interested in these issues in the 1880s and through much of the 1890s, then you're going to start to see changes after the turn of the 20th century in what we call the progressive era. So keep this in mind that those issues didn't just get solved by themselves or just go away. It's because people did something about it and started demanding from the government that something needed to be done about the excesses of big business. So I think it's important to study history because we can better understand why society and government functions the way it does today and where we were at a point when there was no government intervention, very small government, no regulation. When you hear, a lot of times people on TV are always talking about, we all got to get rid of big government, we got to get rid of all this regulation. I mean, obviously, we probably all can agree that, there is too much regulation and oversight in some areas. But why did it occur, and why were people demanding it over 100 years ago? It was because it was nearly intolerable. Life was nearly intolerable at the time. And there was no single entity that could deal with these massive problems other than the federal government, whose power could reach to all areas of society, which is often very frustrating for a historian when I see often uninformed politicians on television just spouting off about all kinds of things. And it's like, well, do they really know what life was like before? No, I doubt it. Okay, so let's move on to 18. Creating a democratic paradise. And that's what the progressives were trying to do. We've been talking about the many problems within society, monopolies, political corruption is a huge hindrance to progress, of course. One of the horrific occurrences that is relating to labor history is when the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory caught fire in New York City on March 25th, 1911, killing 146 people. Many of them were young immigrant women who worked in this sweatshop, and they were unable to escape because the doors were locked. Paul.
Yeah, I found it interesting that the reason the owners of that factory said that the reason why they did that was to keep waste material from escaping.
Yeah, they did not want these young women to take breaks
And
or
also,
bathroom breaks.
I think it was I think it was at the time that the regulations for the fire department were lacking.
Like no regulations is the problem. That is the whole problem. That brings about a great deal of regulation, actually, this fire in New York City. It's seen as a horrible national tragedy. Many of the women actually didn't die from the fire. They actually died from jumping out the windows to escape the fire. Often holding hands, two of them together. So people thought initially when they saw from a distance that they were throwing bags of clothing out the window, but it was actually the women in their dresses. So certainly that horrible catastrophe led many people to push New York to make some type of regulation as far as companies locking their doors, for one thing, closing off the escape routes. But the progressive movement was middle class that wanted the government to rid the government of corruption and turn it into a middle class paradise where economic security, education, health, and civility flourished. Think about the City Beautiful movement that came up in the last chapter, and those ideas of how many people in the late 19th century were saying that we need some type of urban planning just so that we can create a better environment to begin with in which people can live. So you can have safe drinking water, you can have a good sewage system, you can have wide streets with beautiful buildings that provide enough access for people, that can inspire people, clean places in which people can live and work. And then, of course, that goes on to many other areas. People getting paid well, being protected at work, having good educations, having enough to eat, and good health care will create a better citizen. So this is one of a few screens of progressive demands that I want you to know. So make sure you write them down. And I'll go through and talk about them in a second here. So I'm going to start at the top. So as we know, in the past, previous decades, that the farmers were upset by these big corporations that had a lot of power, and they felt that the government needed to do something about them, specifically the railroads, which were giving the low rates to the big corporations and the high rates per ton to the small farmer. And so this remains, this idea that big business should have some type of regulation. Just like the populists, the progressives want to have an income tax, because if you are going to have a government that creates regulation laws, you're going to need to have a bureaucracy that can be sure to oversee those laws and ensure that they will be followed. And of course, the federal government historically had a small budget with little revenue. Where were the two main sources of revenue for the federal government before a federal income tax?
Wasn't it tariffs and banks?
Yes. No. So tariffs. Yes. So tariffs. So taxes on imported goods, and then the sale of land. The federal government's the largest single owner of land. The prohibition of alcohol. So the temperance movement had been around already before this time, but that is an area still of concern, causing great problems in society. Alcoholism, because of course, what the whole family is affected if the main breadwinner. Remember, even though men are making low wages, they're making more than women and more than children. So if the men abandon their families, then their wives and children have a much, much more difficult life.
There's a quote from my book that I got called "The Crime in the Great Lakes," and one of the quote that says, "In act of parliament, you can't prohibit someone from drinking just by an act of parliament."
Well, for one thing, we don't have a parliament. We have Congress. So you might be reading something about the British temperance movement, which I cannot speak to because I'm not a British historian. So, the prohibition of alcohol could be prohibited in the United States by local governments. And so to that point, then we do see in the United States that it was on a local level that the Prohibition movement made its greatest gains in the 19th century and the early 20th century. You see alcohol being prohibited by towns and by counties or townships. And so even to this day, there's dry counties in this country. So I've heard about people going to the Jack Daniels tours where they make it. You can make it in whatever county it is down there, but you can't drink it there. You can't buy it there because it's a dry county. So, local and municipal reforms. So that's relating to reforms in the way that, say, your local town or city government is run. Many people are upset with the power that, say, mayors have, is a good example. And then, of course, if you have a corrupt politician who is running your city, it's difficult to remove them until the next election. So the idea would be that perhaps you should have, say, a city manager. So the manager would be an employee, would have the same types of responsibilities as a mayor, but would not be a politician. And therefore, if he or she was not doing, in those days would have been he, would not have been doing a good job, then they could be removed without having to wait until the next election. So that's that idea. Compulsory school attendance, of course, came up in the last chapter. And do you remember what the major reason behind that was?
Kids were working and not getting enough education.
Okay, so that certainly was a concern, so would not give them a good future. But who were most of these kids that were working? Where were they coming from?
Poor immigrant families.
Yep, so they're poor from Southern and Eastern Europe. They're not considered Americans. They want to make them Americans. So the major concern is we have to make these people Americans. And so the way we can do that is by sending them to school, to public schools. And then, of course, to have a better future for themselves if they're educated. Of course, and that's always, certainly there had always been a greater emphasis on education anyway, historically, even before this period, in the North than in the South. Just want you to remember that. And then better conditions for prisoners. This is something that certainly had been around for at least a little while by the progressive movement. But there's obviously various ideas about how prisoners should have been treated. Some people just thinking they should be incarcerated and just not do anything. And then there was a train of thought that they should have not only recreational activities and being able to, go out of their cells, but to learn a trade, be able to go to school, try to better themselves so that when they get out of prison that they don't commit crimes again and they become productive members of society.
I think that idea still carry on today.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of things that we talk about today aren't necessarily, we haven't completely solved these issues. But certainly there's greater understanding about many of these issues today, and some of them obviously have been solved, such as women's suffrage was an issue that actually women began campaigning for the vote even before the Civil War. But it's not until the 20th century that actually women will get the right to vote. The direct elections of United States senators, something of great concern because of the political corruption, and senators, according to the Constitution, were appointed by their states and not elected by the people of their states. And so it's not until the progressive movement is able to get enough support to change the Constitution that the states are able to do that in the 20th century. Political corruption, of course, is rampant in the late 19th and early 20th century. So primary elections is a way to limit the power of the political machine as well, because now the political machine will not be behind the senators being elected or not put into office, or behind the main candidates, the various candidates being chosen. It will be up to the people. So that's why we have primary elections today, and you just don't have smoke-filled rooms with a few people making all the major decisions of who the candidates are going to be. Initiatives, referendums, and recalls, all part of this idea that the people want to have greater say in the political process. So what gets adopted during the progressive era is that the people can have a say. That if you think there's an issue that there needs to be a law passed, but the politicians in your state are not proposing some type of change, the people can actually go out, get signatures, and get an issue put on the ballot, and therefore change the law that way. So you can have these initiatives, which will have the referendums, which the people will vote on, and then if there are, say, politicians who you want to remove, you can have a recall. If you can get enough signatures, depending on what the rules are for that in your state, you can recall politicians and have another election, a special election, before the person's term in office is up. The regulation of campaign expenses, something that was controversial then and something which, of course, is still controversial today, in which, I think I brought this up previously. William McKinley ran for president in 1896. John D. Rockefeller gives $50,000 to his campaign. So who do you think McKinley was going to listen to when, say, Rockefeller wanted to talk to the president? Obviously, money buys you access. Now, it might not change the politician's view, hopefully, or may. It depends. But, it definitely buy you a lot of access, as opposed to probably you or me, who might give $5. You think they're going to listen to us. So, and that obviously was controversial. There was a period in the 20th century where we thought this issue had been dealt with, but in recent years, with political PACs being allowed to form, now you can have millions of dollars which are given without actually knowing where the money is coming from. And often these PACs having very close ties to the politician themselves. And so that all relates to the prohibition of corporations from contributing to campaigns, which was part of this. Child labor, as we know, I talked about it before, is nothing was really being done about it, other than, of course, you see it becoming more and more common to have laws that made children go to school. And that does have a large impact on large numbers of children not going to school. But that all really depends, too, on where it's going to be and whether there's a law about children going to school or not, and then if it's enforced. So if you have a law that says children have to attend school to a certain age, that's fine, but in some cases it may not be enforced. I had an entire course on history of education when I was at U of M, and so it's all quite sketchy. It's really more about where you live and then what's being done in your local areas. The federal government was very hesitant about doing anything to regulate child labor. Finally, in the progressive era, though, they do pass the Keating-Owen Act, which does limit children working. The Keating-Owen Act stated that no goods produced by children could cross state lines. And that, in the early 20th century, does largely put an end to child labor. Not completely. It's really not till the 1930s that the federal government will come out and pass a law that states that children cannot work before a certain age.
What is the minimum age
for children?
Yeah.
I think, what is it, 15 or 16? I think maybe, was it 15 with if your parents sign?
I think it's
Or is it 16? Okay. I don't know.
maybe changed, and a lot of places want you to be 18 now.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
Okay. So, I knew it used to be either 15 or 16, like when I was a kid. But your parents had a sign, I thought.
I think they stopped doing that because they don't want to work with you in your school schedule if you're in high school.
Oh, okay. Again, the reduced number of work hours, as we said in the beginning of class, was traditionally 12. You see it starting to go to 10. Michigan, it went to 10 in the 1880s. And you do start to see it drop in some instances below 10, but not to 8 hours. 8 hours doesn't become the standard work schedule, really. In the 1930s is really when that occurs. The coal strike of 1902, you do see the coal miners in this country get a reduction in their hours to 9 hours. So that's one example of it going below 10. Widows' pensions, workmen's compensation, and unemployment insurance, all relating to being killed or injured on the job. And as we know, corporations felt no responsibility to their workers. And this is something that you will gradually see changing in the 20th century as corporations are really forced to be more responsible. And they can't make these huge profits and still have no responsibility to their workers. And you'll start to see laws that will change in the 20th century. But in some cases, it will take decades, and it will not be during the early 20th century that will happen. It's really not till major labor unions have protection under the law in the 1930s. So, so President William McKinley, I think that was the last slide I showed last week, or one of the last slides last week. McKinley had won the election of 1896, and he serves a complete term as president, and then he will win re-election in the 1900 presidential election. In 1900, Theodore Roosevelt will be his vice president. Roosevelt was the hero of the Spanish-American War. We'll learn more about him today, as well as probably on Thursday, or maybe next Tuesday, depends on where we are. We'll definitely be talking about Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War coming up. But McKinley, unfortunately, is assassinated. He will be now the third president in this country to be assassinated in the course of less than 40 years. So he's shot by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, on September 5th, 1901, when he was visiting the World's Fair in Buffalo. It was called the Pan American Exposition. The president and Mrs. McKinley were there to see the wonders of the fair. It was very much like the World's Fair in 1893, so it was quite large, extravagant. It had these elaborate canals that had been dug through the fairgrounds in which you could travel and see the amazing buildings. And the president was receiving people who were there to meet him in one of the exposition halls. There was a large line of people there, and Leon Czolgosz had his hand bandaged up that looked like it was injured, but he actually had a small pistol in there. And when the president stretches out his hand to shake Czolgosz's hand, he's shot twice. And doesn't die right away, as I showed here, but he will linger for 9 days before he dies of an infection. I think both Garfield and McKinley are said to have died not necessarily from the gunshot wound, but from the infection that occurred afterwards. And thought that probably the infection that was given to them by the doctors poking around at a time when there still wasn't as much understood about germs. I mean, people did know during this period, people were actually quite cleanly, and people were really obsessive about cleaning their houses in the late 19th century. But still, there's not the types of medical protocols that we would have today. And certainly, it's quite likely that McKinley would have survived had there been the type of medical knowledge then that there is today. But unfortunately, he dies. It's really a heart-wrenching situation because his wife had been terribly ill, and then she is left, when he's gone, left alone. So, Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of the Spanish-American War, now becomes the 26th president of the United States. Roosevelt is a fascinating character who had opinions on everything, had been a great outdoors man. As a young man, after the death of his first wife, in order to try to get over the shock of it all, he goes to his ranch in Montana, where he lives with his ranch hands, and just like a cowboy, except for he wore a really gaudy cowboy outfit that he bought from Brooks Brothers in Manhattan, which was apparently quite alarming. It's sort of like you might see in a 1950s Western, but apparently had the respect of his ranch hands because he worked just as hard as everybody else. He loved to hunt. He believed, unlike many people in power in those days, he believed that some monopolies or trusts were bad, and he actually used the power of the presidency to direct the Justice Department to file lawsuits against big corporations. He didn't believe that all companies were bad. He certainly didn't believe that creating wealth or making a lot of money was bad, but he did believe that making money in an unscrupulous way, a dishonest way, was certainly bad, and therefore the federal government should step in to try to do something about corporations that were misusing the type of power that they had because of their size and their wealth. So here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt depicting him shooting one bear cub but saving the other. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt inspires the toy manufacturer to create the teddy bear when he does not shoot this little bear cub when he was apparently out hunting one time. Paul.
The story behind it goes that the bear cub was actually tied up and he refused to shoot it.
Oh, refused to shoot it. Oh, okay, thanks. That must be why it's on the leash. Yeah. Roosevelt certainly did love the great outdoors, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Shortly after Roosevelt becomes president, Ida Tarbell writes her famous expose on Standard Oil Company for McClure's magazine. And Tarbell, like many muckraking journalists of the day, were writing about problems in society. And that's the major thing about muckraking journalists. They're writing about all these problems that we've been talking about the last few weeks. And trying to bring attention to the plight of so many people in this country. And in Tarbell's case, she really had an axe to grind with Standard Oil. Her father, when she was growing up, was ruined by John D. Rockefeller. Her father worked in the oil business, and it was because of Standard Oil's ruthless business practices that financially ruined her family. And she wanted the people to know about how they operated. And that would eventually lead to the Justice Department under Roosevelt filing a suit against Standard Oil. And Roosevelt, of course, supported the Sherman Antitrust Act. And Roosevelt will not initially direct the Justice Department to act against Standard Oil, but against the Northern Securities Company. Northern Securities Company was this vast empire of ships and railroads that crossed the continent, crossed the Atlantic. It was said that you could travel from Europe and across the United States to the Pacific Ocean and never leave a ship or a train that was owned by Northern Securities. J.P. Morgan, who's one of the major owners of Northern Securities, of course, who saved the economy back in the 1890s. But J.P. Morgan and his partners owned nearly all the railroads west of the Mississippi River, eliminating competition. So it's a huge monopoly. And here's this cartoon with Teddy Roosevelt as a cop. He's dressed as a police officer of the day, confronting Northern Securities, all dressed up like a robber baron would have dressed at the time. And in the back, you can see the Interstate Commerce Commission doorway, because the Interstate Commerce Commission, of course, is created to regulate the railroads and set the maximum rates that could be charged. 1902 is a significant year because it's also the year that the coal miners in this country go on strike. And Roosevelt supports the coal miners and not the big robber barons who own the company. Roosevelt says that when the coal mine owners say they're not going to negotiate with the workers, which of course was affecting the economy, everything ran on coal. Coal was the major source of fuel of the day. The president said, if you don't go back to the negotiating tables, I'm going to send in federal troops and we're going to take the mines from you. We're going to nationalize them and we're going to run them. That terrified the owners, and they were forced to go back and negotiate. So unlike so many politicians, people in power of the day, that it was not uncommon to send in troops to break up strikes at this time period. Roosevelt was not going to do that, and if he did, he was going to do it by taking the companies from these robber barons and then putting the men back to work that way.
What do you think the reason for other presidents did this? Did they feel that they would cause like riots or something?
Other presidents broke up the
Yeah.
the strikes? Oh, because they sympathized with the owners. They were all of the same wealthy class, and they held many of the same beliefs, that they thought that these immigrants were, not worthy of getting treated well. Remember, so many of these people had these ideas of social Darwinism that were common amongst the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of the time. And it was primarily the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that had the power at the time and had the majority of the wealth. The Roosevelt Justice Department was successful in its fight then against Northern Securities. In 1904, the company was broken up. And muckrakers will continue to write articles, just like they do today. We don't call them muckrakers. We call them exposés, investigative journalists would be a more modern term. But muckrakers is the same idea. It was the idea that they're out in the mud, like trying to rake around, searching for all the problems. Muckrakers weren't necessarily writing about how to solve the problems. I mean, that's pretty daunting problems. There's so many of the problems of the time, overwhelming, but they're at least trying to bring about public awareness and hopefully change would come, and often it did. Often not right away, but finally Standard Oil, 4 years after Ida Tarbell's expose on Standard Oil, the Roosevelt Justice Department will file suit against John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Of course, John D. Rockefeller, again, remembers the wealthiest man in the country, the nation's first billionaire, and therefore with that kind of money, he can hire the best lawyers. And this lawsuit will drag on for many years. It's not until William Howard Taft is actually president of the United States that finally the lawsuit will be settled. John D. Rockefeller will be forced to break up his Standard Oil Company into many smaller companies. Now, in the end, did that really hurt Standard Oil and John D. Rockefeller? No, not necessarily, because it's just broken up into smaller but still successful companies. Rockefeller and the investors in Standard Oil will then receive shares of stock in these other corporations that are created out of the main company as they're broken off. And so it's said in the end that John D. Rockefeller actually ends up making even more money. But they have to be run separately now. They can't be run with the same board of directors. In 1906, the Hepburn Act was passed, regulating the railroads, telling the railroads that they could only charge a maximum rate. So actually specifying the specific rate. And so that's the first time in history that is actually done. And so, so these ideas of laissez-faire, which so many people still believe in, are being challenged. And it's quite incredible so early still because of the rampant corruption which exists in politics. But you can see that our politicians are starting to pay more attention to what the public wants. and that with this power that the middle class voter has, that this change is occurring. You see people begin to demand that they want the government to ensure that the food that they are eating is going to be safe. With more and more people living in towns and cities, you no longer don't know where your food is coming from. You know, when you lived on the farm, you saw where your food was coming from. You saw it growing in the fields. You saw the animals that were being raised in the barnyards. You knew where your food was going to come from. Now that people are eating processed food that's being packed in factories, you don't know how it's being handled. Yeah.
I think during the industrial, I think people living in rural areas had better, cleaner food than I think urbans.
I mean, that's the idea in general, of course, because they were the ones producing it, obviously. Historically, in America, when we were a colony, and even nutrition rates were always higher here in North America than they were for the people back in Europe. But this book, which was actually written by Upton Sinclair, so it's called The Jungle, he wrote it because he wanted to bring about awareness of the terrible living conditions and working conditions of the poor working in the meatpacking plants in Chicago. It's a novel. It's a fictional novel, but it's nevertheless talking about actual true life situations that were going on. The major impact that the novel had on the American public was not necessarily to do something initially about the working conditions of the meatpacking plants, but actually to do something to make changes in order to ensure that the food supply was safe. Because Sinclair is writing about the slaughterhouses when the cattle's being brought in and that there's not good drainage, and so they're killing all these large cattle, and the blood is just draining there onto the floor. And in some cases, it's coming to be like so high, the blood, that it could get like chest deep or waist deep. And so they're working in unhealthy conditions, these big packing plants where they're producing all kinds of sausages, but lots of what they would have called tinned meat. We'd call it canned food today, but a lot of packaged or packed meat, which there's not a lot of meat that's canned nowadays. I guess Spam is probably the only thing that I can think of. There must be a few other things, but that was more common as well, to have like canned meat or stews. Well, I guess canned stews and things like that still today. But there were no regulations, and there's no OSHA. So, so Sinclair talks about things like a person falling into a big vat. There's these massive factories that are producing enormous quantities of stewed things, mystery meats they might call them at the time, and someone falling in and then not knowing what happened to the person, and then until the whole giant cauldron, which was literally could be as big as this room, massive like cauldrons of things cooking, and then they'd be cleaning it out after they canned everything, and they'd find a person's bones in the bottom. So people read this book and they're absolutely horrified that, and they demand that the politicians do something about it, which they do, and they pass two laws: the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspections Act in 1906, that prohibit the sale of adulterated or misbranded livestock. So you couldn't say that it's veal and ham if it's going to be just ham or whatever else, or
I think Theodore Roosevelt read this and he was absolutely disgusted.
The president did read it. Yeah, he did. So So you had support from all areas of society and government for the passage of this law. This was not something that people were disagreeing about, because nobody wanted to eat this type of food and nobody wanted to feed this type of food to their families. So they wanted to make sure that the food was going to be safe. Of course, it's a problem in society today because we have these laws, but there's a lack of money to pay for the proper amount of inspectors. And that's why so often, unfortunately, more and more often, you start to hear about these recalls. And actually, in about the last 30 years, the number of cattle companies that actually, or meat packing companies, has been reduced so greatly that the majority of the red meat that's being processed in this country is only being processed by a handful of corporations, where even, like, go back to the 1980s, there were several dozen companies. And so now, if there's a problem, that means that a wider range of meat is contaminated because there's so few companies that's actually processing it today.
This would actually kill a person if they ate spoiled meat.
It often happens. In the 19th century, though, and even before people lived in cities, where they were eating adulterated food products that were being canned, because historically there's not really great ways to preserve food for long periods of time, other than, well, certainly you can pickle things or cure them in salt, brine them, but because there would be a lot of botulism historically, people did die very commonly from the food that they ate. So that was one of the major problems in society before modern canning methods were developed in the 19th century. So here's we're going to move to a little bit about economic history, and then we'll move back to Roosevelt. And 1907, Frederick Heinz, he's this millionaire, kind of playboy from out west. Every year he would come to New York City to deal with his business interests, cause a big stir apparently, because he would have a fleet of cars that would all be driving up and down the streets of Manhattan in the days before there were even that many automobiles. He had the idea that he was going to corner the copper market. But his plan doesn't work the way he thought it was going to work. And actually he ends up losing most of his fortune when he sets off the Panic of 1907, because his scheme backfires. It leads to the collapse of the Knickerbocker Bank, the Knickerbocker Trust Company as it was formerly known, when there was a run on the bank and a single day $8 million was withdrawn. They didn't have enough cash on hand to meet their obligations, and they were forced to close, sending shockwaves through the financial system. So, very much like what happened, 10 years ago. So, just like back in 1893, the economy goes into a downward spiral, and what to do about it, because, of course, there's nothing in place where the federal government can do anything about it. There's no laws. There's no system. The government doesn't really have the finances to do anything anyway. And so what do? Just like back in the 1890s, government turns to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan uses the power of his bank, the Morgan Bank, and his influence in the banking community to get wealthy businessmen in the nation's financial capital, New York City, to stop the financial collapse. One of these people is John D. Rockefeller, who takes $10 million of his own money in order to stop the collapse of one bank. The Tennessee Coal and Iron Company is shored up when the federal government allows J.P. Morgan to buy it. Rather interesting because, of course, Northern Securities had just been broken up by the federal government. And yet, in this instance, the federal government allows Morgan to take control of this large company.
It's kind of weird that
Here we see Morgan with his, grasping billions of dollars. Obviously, it was in his own interest too, because if the country's finances did hit rock bottom, it would have been obviously terrible for everybody, but he would have lost a great deal of money as well.
I think the businessmen realized that if that the economy tanked, they were done.
Right. Well, although Morgan is willing to go along with this, and he's the one organizing it. Actually, initially, many of these businessmen were not that willing to go along with him, but he's able to force them into it.
I think the idea that them going bankrupt probably scared them.
I think the idea of anyone going bankrupt will scare you. So because of the financial collapse of 1907, which of course was a trend, every 10 to 15 years, of course, there was a major economic downturn. It led to enough support eventually in 1913 to create the Federal Reserve, which is the banker's bank. It created the Federal Reserve notes, so a new federal currency. The Federal Reserve would now be in charge of setting interest rates, and that makes loans to commercial banks. It would oversee the supply of the currency, including the coins that were minted. It would also hold funds in reserve to help in times of crisis. So no longer would the government have to turn to a private individual to stop a financial collapse, such as Morgan had done twice now. But the federal government would now have the authority and the ability to be able to try to shore up the economy on its own.
I think Morgan probably was happy.
I imagine he was.
Was the government that if the Federal Reserve Act had been passed beforehand, would this not have happened, or would it still?
It's hard to speculate. I mean, there's been plenty of laws put in place, obviously, since 1913, and look at what happened to the economy in 2008 and 2009. So. Often the problem is there might, even with regulation, it's how is that regulation being enforced, or is it being enforced? Because in the end, it's really up to the people who are in charge of overseeing regulation that, are they actually doing their job? Are they looking out for the best interests of the nation, or are they intimidated by these large and powerful corporations? And I know there was a lot of criticism about that back during the financial panic 10 years ago, that many of these government employees were often intimidated when they were going in as inspectors to really say too much. So this is all going on during President Roosevelt's term of office, and Roosevelt is shown here. I don't know if you can pick him out. It's right here in California, a trip he made out west as president. And Roosevelt is, part of his legacy, of course, is that he was a conservationist. He doubles the size of the national park system while he's president, from 4 to 8 national parks. So certainly that's a big part of his legacy. Roosevelt believed that because the government was the largest single owner of land in the United States, that land didn't always have to be preserved. He certainly believed in preserving some land, like the national parks, but he believed that a lot of the land could be responsibly used. And so that's why we often say that he's a conservationist, because he thought that, say there's timber, or say there's oil, then that land could be leased out, the government could receive profits from that land, then that money could go to benefit you and me. The nation as a whole could benefit from the wealth that the government got from some of its land.
I think Roosevelt was the first conservationist I think he was probably one of the few people that understood that if you conserve resources, we would probably be better off.
Yeah, well, it's certainly fortunate for the nation that you had someone in position of power to be able to do something about it. It was part of the progressive thought at the time. Many people were certainly very concerned about what the nation was going to be in the future. Were there going to be any forests left? Was there going to be any wildlife left for their children and grandchildren to see? Because if you recall, when I showed you some of those pictures of the logging here in Michigan, how they were clear-cutting the entire state, and there's literally almost no forest left in the state at the turn of the 20th century. And that's going on throughout the country. So Roosevelt, of course, is remembered for a great number of things. He's being a trust buster, being a conservationist, and increasing the powers of the presidency, certainly important. But he decides to follow in the footsteps of Washington and retire after really 2 terms, because it was only a few months from the time that McKinley started his 2nd term until Roosevelt became president. And so essentially you have Roosevelt retiring, although he was quite young. He's not even 50 years old yet. And he throws his support to William Howard Taft, who was the Secretary of War in his cabinet. And Roosevelt and Taft were very good friends. It's really because of Roosevelt's support that Taft gets the nomination for the presidency. And but then things seem to sour between Taft and Roosevelt. Roosevelt leaves the country, actually, goes on an extended tour of Europe when he retires with his wife. But when he comes back, he starts to quietly criticize Taft and begin to make plans that he's going to run for the presidency again. This was, of course, very upsetting to Taft. The two had been so close. And so personally, Taft was offended. But Taft was not willing to back down, and he will run for the presidency when he goes to run in the 1912 election. And so Taft, though, is remembered as a trust buster, just like Roosevelt. Taft, though, is only a 1-term president. And so often 1-term presidents, historically tend to get ignored by the history books, and we don't spend very much time talking about them. But it is important to remember that he was actually more aggressive towards the monopolies in this country than Roosevelt was. There were more corporations that the government filed suit against than under Roosevelt's 7 years. In Taft's only 4 years. So that's significant.
After Roosevelt, that we only limit presidents' terms to 2
Yeah, that's not until Franklin Roosevelt, who was the cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, when he won 4 elections in the 1930s and 40s, it then gets limited because there was a lot of animosity towards by many Republicans that the Democrat could have won so many terms. So I don't know. Was it a good idea? I don't know. That's all. Everything like that's debatable. Certainly, you could point out that Eisenhower could have won a 3rd term at least, if not perhaps a 4th term. Eisenhower was so popular, and he was a Republican. Ronald Reagan probably could have won a 3rd, if not a 4th term as well. So, But anyway, the country decided that it would be best to limit the terms. Yeah.
I think Taft was more aggressive because I feel like that he saw. I think one of the reasons why Taft was more aggressive was I think he saw trusts were. I think he believed that trusts were more harmful than good.
I suppose, although in many respects Taft is seen as being often taking the traditional view of the Republican Party, and so which was being criticized by Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was certainly much more progressive and really was a progressive. So here you see Teddy Roosevelt trying in this cartoon when he's trying to get the Republican nomination in 1912. And Taft, so here's Roosevelt holding on to the grand old party, and here's Taft pulling him away. In the end, the party did support Taft, and Roosevelt did not get the nomination, though, in 1912. Roosevelt, though, never being one to give up, continues with his quest to become president, and will go on to form the Progressive Party, which is commonly known as the Bull Moose Party. The reason why it's known as the Bull Moose Party is because one day during the campaign, a reporter asked how Roosevelt felt, and he said he felt as healthy or as good as a bull moose, and so it sort of stuck. And so now in the 1912 election, you have Roosevelt from the Progressive Party as the Bull Moose Party, so you see him here as the moose. You have Taft, who got the Republican nomination, and of course the symbol for the Republican Party is the elephant. And then finally, the Democrats will nominate Woodrow Wilson, the governor of New Jersey. And that's the donkey there. So here the 3 of them are Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson, all running for the presidency. Wilson was not assured the nomination when he shows up at the Democratic National Convention in 1912. Wilson actually was only new to politics. He had been the president of Princeton University and was an academic, so he had either taught or he had been a lawyer early on in his career, but mostly was a teacher, and then for about the last 20 years of his career had been the president of Princeton University, and was only convinced in 1910 by the political bosses in New Jersey who thought they could control him to run for the governorship in 1910. And Wilson won that election, but when he won, he made a name for himself as being a trust buster and actually going against the political bosses who thought they could control him. Yeah, so it's quite ironic. And he could think for himself, and he wasn't going to be told what to do, and therefore he gets a number of followers from across the country. And so he runs for the presidency in 1912, but he is not at all guaranteed that he's going to get the nomination, because it was Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, who had been in politics for several decades, who had made a lot of political friends, but also made a lot of political enemies, who was the front runner. But he did not have the number of delegates that he needed. He was short a few delegates, and so during the party convention, there's vote after vote after vote after vote, and yet Champ Clark doesn't have the majority according to the rules that he needs. And gradually, as the votes keep going, literally dozens of votes, finally, after 46 separate ballots, the tide turned and Woodrow Wilson received the nomination. And so there's poor Champ Clark trying to hold on to the tail of the donkey as Wilson's running away with the party nomination. And so Wilson, who had only been in politics for 2 years, will now be the Democratic Party's nominee for the presidency of the United States. And again, that's not guaranteed, because who was the only Democrat to win the presidency in the previous decades of the 19th century? Only one.
Wasn't it Grant?
Nope, Grant's a Republican.
Oh,
Served 2 non-consecutive terms. No, Roosevelt's Republican too. It's all Republicans except for one guy who won, and then he lost, and then he won again. Remember I said a week or so ago? What's that?
Cleveland.
Exactly. It was Grover Cleveland. Very good. So there is no guarantee that Wilson is going to win. But what's the major factor that will give him the White House? It was Roosevelt splitting the Republican Party vote into 2, and so that in the end, that's what will happen. And this election will really be between Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, and Theodore Roosevelt, the progressive, not President of the United States, William Howard Taft. Woodrow Wilson will run a campaign that's referred to as New Freedom. He'll run on a philosophy that promised to restore competition to the marketplace. He calls for limited government. He certainly doesn't believe in corporations having too much power, but he also doesn't believe that the government should be stepping in all the time, telling corporations what they can and cannot do.
I find that ironic now because the Democrats are in favor of putting more restrictions.
Right, but historically the Democratic Party is about small government and little or no regulation. At least the southern branch of the Democratic Party historically believed that. Because what you see emerge over the course of the century after the Civil War is that there's 2 branches of the Democratic Party. You have a southern branch, which is the party of white supremacy and limited government, and then you have a northern branch, which is the party of the working class people, the uneducated immigrant, who and therefore fighting for the little guy. And then, of course, a lot of political corruption, which was going on both in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So it will be eventually the northern branch, that will be the modern Democratic Party that we're used to. And then in the South, it will be the that branch of the Republican Party that was for limited government, will start to vote with the Republicans, and eventually, by the late 20th century, change to the Republican Party. But it's a gradual shift that will occur over the course of about a century. Woodrow Wilson actually is a Southerner, even though he spent much of his career living in New Jersey. He was born in Virginia shortly after, or short, what did I put when he was born? Right around the time of the Civil War. I can't remember off the top of my head what exactly. I think 1859. I think he was born just before the Civil War began, but doesn't really have any memories of it, but grew up listening to a lot of stories about Reconstruction and the Civil War. And so many of his core ideas come from his youth growing up in the South. And so in that respect, he's very much a Southern Democrat. Actually quite racist as well. Actually, the first movie shown in the White House is Birth of a Nation, which he actually says something about how it was like it was written in lightning and basically it was all too true, and so which is a horrible interpretation of what Reconstruction was like. It was from a Southerner's point of view. So Theodore Roosevelt runs a campaign known as New Nationalism. New Nationalism was this philosophy of increased government regulation and widespread political reform. So he wanted more government, while to a large extent Wilson wanted less government, which again, like you said, Paul, is kind of just the opposite of what you would think today. But I should point out that Roosevelt really is on the outer fringes of what the Republicans would have thought as well. A lot of Republicans were not happy with him. But of course, that's why he's now progressive. So greater government protections. And these were actually things, just like we looked at earlier, that the progressive movement overall wanted. Roosevelt is specifically talking about in his campaign in 1912. He wants a minimum wage. He wants workman's compensation. He wants an 8-hour workday. He wants federal health care. So if you think it's controversial today, can you imagine how controversial that would have been over 100 years ago?
That was more. I think it was more controversial back then than it is now.
Certainly. He wanted a child labor law. So Roosevelt is saying that he thinks that the federal government has the power to outright make child labor illegal, which of course will not come about until the 1930s. It's only a few years after this, 1916, that the Keating-Owen Act said that children basically could still work, you just can't ship their goods over state lines. And he also was interested in having tariff protections. He wanted to try to protect American workers from a flood of cheap imported manufactured goods. Although actually when we did have a lot of tariff protections, like during the Great Depression, it actually hurt the economy more than it actually helped the economy. I haven't mentioned this fourth candidate, actually. So there's actually Eugene V. Debs, the labor union leader and the head of the Socialist Party, who gets 901,000 votes in the 1912 election. So actually, there's really 4 candidates in this case. And with so many candidates, because 900,000 votes is quite significant still. And then with Teddy Roosevelt taking so many votes away from Taft, in the end, you have Wilson, the winner. He becomes the 28th president of the United States. An intellectual president, often considered to be the smartest president ever in a lot of respects. He had the most education out of any president. And this is actually how the map in 1912 looked between the top 3 candidates. Woodrow Wilson, just over 6 million votes and 435 electoral votes. Theodore Roosevelt, just over 4 million votes, and 88 electoral votes. And then poor President Taft, only about 3.5 million votes in the popular vote and 8 votes in the Electoral College. So Taft will now be forced into retirement. Actually, something that probably worked out for the best. He really had not enjoyed being president anyway. It was not something that he had ever foreseen himself in doing. It's only because of his close friendship with Roosevelt that he gets thrust into that position, and because of his wife, Mrs. Taft, when she saw that he could be president, really pushed him to run back in the 1908 election. And so he was more fulfilling her dream than his. His dream, his entire life, he was a lawyer, was that he wanted to serve on the Supreme Court, something that he would actually be appointed to a few years later. And he would be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the only former president of the United States who will then serve on the Supreme Court was William Howard Taft. And actually, it was way better for President Taft's health because they said he just overate. He was quite a large man to begin with, and then apparently as president, he just ate and ate and ate to kind of compensate for all the misery of being president and all the stress of being president. So, all right. So that's the election of 1912. Let's move on to a little bit about social history and what's going on with this guy, Henry Ford, someone that living in the Detroit area we should all be familiar with. Yeah.
I've actually been to the Henry Ford Museum.
Oh, actually, I'm glad you brought that up. So, I'm going to be going on a field trip probably early next month with my technology history class. And I always offer extra credit to my 2200 classes that you're welcome to join us when we go. So when I set the date, hopefully either tomorrow with that class or next Monday, I'll let you know what's going on. Okay. But Henry Ford, who does not invent the automobile, of course. Hopefully you guys learned that somewhere along the way, although I know oftentimes, at least when I was a kid, they used to say Henry Ford invented the automobile. It was not. It's a German invention. But anyway, he perfects the assembly line is what he does. And Henry Ford's dream was to build an automobile that would be affordable to the average worker. Because automobiles, when they first came about, were really playthings of the rich. They were toys for the very wealthy. And Henry Ford in 1914 will perfect the assembly line, and then he'll do a couple of significant things. He'll increase his workers' pay to double that of the average daily wage, which by 1914 was $2.50 was the average wage, but that really was not enough to live really decently or to buy it, certainly not to buy an automobile. So he doubles his workers' wages to $5 a day, actually getting greatly criticized by many of the wealthy businessmen in this country because they did not want to pay their workers that and give up a lot of their profits. But Henry Ford realized that if you pay your workers well, they will then be part of the marketplace and will be able to afford to buy all these goods that are being produced, including automobiles, that they could not afford. And he reduces their working hours from 10 hours a day. It already was 9 hours because it was already that's right. It was 10 hours. He reduces their hours of work to 9 hours. So for a 9-hour workday, you made $5, which sounds pretty horrible today, but actually it was pretty good at the time. And people came from all over the country to try to get a job at the Ford Motor Company. When he announces this in January of 1914, the lines were stretching down the block and all the way around the corner and down Woodward Avenue at the Highland Park plant. So it's really quite significant what he did. And And soon, the Model T will be the major car on the American roads. Something like half the cars by the 1920s on the roads are Model Ts. And do you know what color they were painted? Yeah, they were painted black because the demand was so great, and black is the color that dried the quickest. So early Model Ts actually were other colors, but once demand becomes so great, they're only black, which had to be extremely confusing to find your car. Yeah.
I've also been to the Ford estate.
That's the Eleanor Ford or the Fairlane Manor?
I think it's Ford.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In Grosse Pointe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually took my classes there one time. It's an interesting tour. If you haven't visited any of the auto baron mansions, that's a great, really fascinating to see how they lived with all the hundreds of millions of dollars that they made. So, so here's a photograph showing Ford's assembly line down at the Highland Park plant. And Model T production rises dramatically. In 1912, Ford Motor Company produced 82,388 cars, and only 4 years later, in 1916, 585,000 Model Ts were being produced. So a dramatic increase, which obviously was really, really good if you owned Ford stock. A friend of mine, her grandfather knew Henry Ford, and he was offered to buy into the company back when it was founded. But Mr. Ford wanted $100, and he didn't have $100 to invest. So, but that would have been millions. The Highland Park assembly plant would be the most modern automobile factory in the world when it was built. And it's still there on Woodward Avenue. It's being used as storage, I understand, today. They're not building cars there. It's actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I have a cousin who used to work for the National Park Service at Sleeping Bear Sand Dunes up north, and it was actually that office that was in charge of just keeping track of it, like taking photographs of it to document it. There's not much they can do because it's not owned by the federal government, but because it's listed on the National Register, then they have to check up to document it, photograph it every once in a while. And I had to drive him actually over there when he was visiting because he wasn't quite sure where it was. So. Between 1908 and 1927, which were the years that the Model T was in production, they produced over 15 million cars here and in the United States. And this car is owned by the Henry Ford Museum. And I don't think I've seen it the last few times I've taken classes there, but I think they rotate the collection, so it's not always on display. And that's Mr. Ford, Henry Ford there sitting in the passenger seat, and his son Edsel who's driving the car. And it's Edsel who lived in the mansion on Lakeshore Drive in Jefferson in Grosse Pointe that's open to the public as a museum now. And then Henry and his wife Clara lived in Fairlane Manor, which is in Dearborn. And it's on the grounds of the University of Michigan Dearborn, although it's no longer owned by the university. It's been sold to like a nonprofit. It's been formed it's part of the Edsel and Eleanor Ford House. That's what it is. So the mansion in Grosse Pointe, the son's mansion, has now taken over ownership of it, and they're in the process of restoring it. And that's really fascinating because the mansion in Dearborn is they've completed the main restoration of the exterior, and they're working on the interior now. And because there was a big auction in the 1950s after Mrs. Ford died, a lot of things have disappeared. Some things have come back to the mansion, but a lot of the things inside were sold off and nobody knows where they went to. So what they're in the process of doing is they're actually recreating every single room exactly how it was when the Fords moved in. And if they can't find the exact same item, because some things were bought from like department stores, they're having them recreated. So say a lamp that might have cost $50, because they would have bought top-of-the-line things, might cost like $5,000 to have an artisan make it from scratch. So it's quite amazing what they're doing. It's giving a lot of historians and craftspeople who normally don't have a lot of good jobs, like really good jobs for right now. The model, because of the assembly line, the Model T, which was nicknamed the Tin Lizzie, the price drops dramatically. And over the course of, from the time it first comes out to the mid-1920s, the price drops went from $825 to a low of $298. Not something that we're used to seeing. I mean, generally because of assembly lines or because of mass production, certainly prices do drop dramatically. But you know, we tend not to see cars in our lifetime, of course, the price go down. We're used to them going up. But this was Mr. Ford's, what he saw as his major goal to do was to produce a car that every person could afford, which it was true. My grandma grew up on a farm in the UP. They were extremely poor, and they were able to buy a car eventually in the 1920s. It was a Model T truck, actually. So we will move back to a little bit about politics, and then we'll call it a day. In 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act is passed. Because the Sherman Antitrust Act had inherent problems, it was often unenforceable. The Clayton Antitrust Act will be passed in order to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act and by defining unfair business practices. So it actually outlines what is not fair for big corporations to do, and it exempts unions from prosecution. Corporations were trying to get trade unions to be incorporated under the Antitrust Act. But that, of course, would have gutted the power of the unions, something, of course, the robber barons wanted to happen. And the government was unwilling to do so. Let me just see. I think we're going to stop here. I think that's a good place to stop. We'll continue with Carrie Nation when I see you on Tuesday.
Good luck with today's lesson.